Turn the last page of the Old Testament, and the next page is the New Testament. It looks like one step. It is actually 400 years. 400 years of no prophet, no new scripture, no recorded voice from heaven. The period between Malachi and Matthew is the longest silence in the biblical story, and most people skip it entirely. They close Malachi and open Matthew and assume nothing happened in between. That is a mistake, because what happened in those 400 years explains almost everything you find confusing in the New Testament. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the synagogues, why everyone is speaking Greek, why Rome is in charge, why the people are so desperate for a Messiah. None of that existed when the Old Testament ended. All of it existed when the New Testament began. Something massive happened in between, and God was in the middle of it, even though He was not speaking. This is the story of the 400 silent years. They were anything but silent. When the Old Testament closes, around 430 BC, the Jewish people are living under the Persian Empire, the same empire that let them go home after the Babylonian exile, the same empire that funded the rebuilding of the temple under Ezra and the walls under Nehemiah. The Persians were, by ancient standards, remarkably tolerant rulers. They let the Jews practice their religion. They let them keep their laws. They let them worship at the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Life was not glorious, but it was stable. The high priest in Jerusalem was the effective leader of the Jewish community. There was no king, no prophet, just the priesthood, the temple, and the Torah. That arrangement would last for about 100 years, and then the world changed overnight. A 24-year-old Macedonian general named Alexander swept through the ancient world like a wildfire. He had already defeated the Persian army, he had taken Egypt, and on his march between the two, he passed through the land of Israel. Alexander did not just conquer territory, he conquered culture. Everywhere his armies went, Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek architecture, and Greek gods followed. This process is called Hellenization, and it would become the single greatest cultural threat to the Jewish faith in the entire intertestamental period. Alexander was not hostile to the Jews. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, he visited Jerusalem and was shown the prophecies of Daniel that foretold his empire. Whether every detail of that story is historical, the point is clear. The Jews survived Alexander's conquest without a military confrontation. He left their religion intact. But the Greek culture he left behind was another matter entirely. Alexander died in 323 BC at the age of 32. He had built the largest empire the world had ever seen, and when he died, he left no heir strong enough to hold it. His generals carved it into pieces. Two of those pieces matter for our story. The southern piece, centered in Egypt, went to a general named Ptolemy. The northern piece, centered in Syria, went to a general named Seleucus. And the land of Israel sat directly between them. For the next 150 years, the Jewish people were caught between two empires. First, the Ptolemies of Egypt controlled the land. Then, the Seleucids of Syria took it. The land changed hands through wars, treaties, and betrayals, and the Jewish people had no say in any of it. Under the Ptolemies, things were relatively peaceful. The Jews were allowed to govern their own religious affairs. And something remarkable happened during this period. Around 250 BC, in the Egyptian city of Alexandria, the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek for the first time. This translation is called the Septuagint. Think about what that means. For the first time in history, a Greek-speaking person could read the words of Moses, David, and Isaiah. The God of Israel was no longer locked inside a language only Jews could read. The scriptures were now accessible to the entire Mediterranean world, and when the apostles later wrote the New Testament in Greek, they quoted from this translation constantly. God was preparing something. But in 198 BC, the Seleucids defeated the Ptolemies and took control of the land. At first, the new rulers continued the old policies. Then, everything changed. In 175 BC, a Seleucid king named Antiochus IV took the throne. He gave himself the title Epiphanes, which means God manifest, and he decided that the Jewish religion had to go. Antiochus was not content to simply rule the Jews politically. He wanted to remake them culturally. He banned circumcision. He outlawed Sabbath observance. He forbade the reading of the Torah under penalty of death. He installed a gymnasium in Jerusalem where Greek athletic games were held in the nude, a direct offense to Jewish modesty. And Jewish men who wanted to participate in Greek culture underwent painful procedures to disguise their circumcision. But the worst was yet to come. In December of 167 BC, Antiochus marched into the temple in Jerusalem and erected an altar to the Greek god Zeus on top of the altar of burnt offering. Then, he sacrificed a pig on it. Let that sink in. The altar where the blood of lambs had been poured for centuries to atone for the sins of God's people was now covered with the blood of an unclean animal, offered to a pagan god. The book of Daniel calls this the abomination of desolation, Daniel 11:31, and Jesus himself would later reference this event as a pattern of what is coming in the last days, Matthew 24:15. Antiochus did not just desecrate the temple, he turned it into a shrine to Zeus. He burned copies of the Torah. He executed mothers who had their sons circumcised and hung the dead infants around their necks as a warning. This was the darkest hour since the Babylonian exile, and it seemed like the Jewish faith might not survive. But it did survive, because of one family. In the small town of Modin, northwest of Jerusalem, a priest named Mattathias refused to offer a pagan sacrifice when Antiochus's officials came to enforce the new law. When another Jew stepped forward to comply, Mattathias killed him and the Seleucid officer on the spot. Then he and his 5 sons fled to the hills and launched a guerrilla war. After Mattathias died, his son Judah took command. His nickname was Maccabeus, the Hammer, and he earned it. Against overwhelming odds, Judah and his brothers fought the Seleucid army with hit-and-run tactics from the Judean hills. They won battle after battle that they had no business winning. In 164 BC, 3 years after the desecration, the Maccabees recaptured Jerusalem. They entered the temple, tore down the altar to Zeus, built a new altar, and rededicated the temple to the God of Israel. That rededication is still celebrated today. It is called Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. And in John 10:22, Jesus himself is found walking in the temple during this feast. The holiday that commemorates a victory God never prophesied through a prophet, in a period when God was supposedly silent. The silence was never empty. It was preparation. If you are learning things about the Bible that you have never heard before, help us reach more people. Subscribe, leave a comment, share this with someone. That is genuinely how this grows. Thank you. The Maccabean period did not just produce a military victory. It reshaped Jewish society in ways that are still visible in the pages of the New Testament. Before the exile, Jewish worship was centered on the temple. After the exile, and especially during the intertestamental period, a new institution emerged, the synagogue. Because the Jews had been scattered across foreign lands, and because many could no longer travel to Jerusalem, local gathering places sprang up wherever Jewish communities existed. These synagogues became the centers of prayer, scripture reading, and teaching. When you read in Luke 4 that Jesus stood up in the synagogue in Nazareth and read from the scroll of Isaiah, you are reading about an institution that did not exist when the Old Testament ended. The synagogue was born in the silence, and it became the platform that Jesus and the apostles used to spread the gospel across the known world. During this same period, 2 major religious parties formed. The Pharisees were laymen and scholars who emphasized strict obedience to the Torah and to the oral traditions that had built up around it. They believed in the resurrection of the dead, in angels, and in a coming Messiah. Most of what they taught was right, but by the time Jesus arrived, many of them had turned the law into a crushing system of performance rather than a relationship with God. The Sadducees were the priestly aristocracy. They controlled the temple. They rejected the oral traditions. They denied the resurrection. They denied angels. And they had made their peace with whatever foreign power was in charge. First the Greeks, then the Romans, because collaboration kept them in power. When Jesus argues with the Pharisees about the Sabbath in Mark 2, or when the Sadducees try to trap him with a question about the resurrection in Matthew 22, you are watching conflicts that were born in these 400 years. The sides were already drawn before Jesus ever opened his mouth. The Maccabees eventually established an independent Jewish kingdom called the Hasmonean dynasty. For about 80 years, the Jews governed themselves for the first time since the Babylonian exile. But the Hasmonean kings became corrupt. They fought each other. They made alliances with foreign powers. And in 63 BC, two rival Hasmonean brothers both appealed to Rome to settle their dispute. Rome was happy to settle it. The Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem, entered the Holy of Holies in the temple, and made Judea a client state of Rome. The Jewish people had invited the wolf into the house. From that point forward, Rome controlled the land. They appointed local rulers. They collected taxes. They built roads. And in 37 BC, they installed a half-Jewish, half-Idumean politician named Herod as king. This is the Herod who will be on the throne when Jesus is born. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now, step back and look at what God did in 400 years of silence. Alexander the Great spread the Greek language across the known world. By the time Jesus was born, almost everyone from Rome to Persia could communicate in one language, Koine Greek. The New Testament would be written in that language. The Gospel could travel without a translator. The Septuagint put the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. For the first time, a Roman soldier or a Greek merchant could read the prophecies of Isaiah. The soil was prepared for the seed. The synagogues gave the apostles a ready-made network. Everywhere Paul traveled, from Antioch to Corinth to Rome, there was already a synagogue where Jews and God-fearing Gentiles gathered to read Scripture. Paul walked into those synagogues and said, "The one you have been reading about has arrived." And Rome built the roads. 60,000 miles of paved highway connecting every major city in the empire. The same roads that carried Roman legions now carried the gospel. Paul captured all of this in one sentence. Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. The fullness of the time. That phrase describes these 400 years, not silence, preparation. God was not absent. He was setting the table. 400 years. No prophet spoke. No scripture was written. And from the outside, it looked like God had walked away. But he had not walked away. He was building roads. He was spreading a language. He was translating his word. He was creating synagogues in every city. He was raising up a people so desperate for deliverance that when the Messiah finally arrived, the Christ-shaped hole in history was exactly the right size. The silence was never the absence of God. It was the patience of God. He was waiting for the moment when every piece was in place. And then, after 4 centuries of nothing, an angel appeared to an old priest named Zechariah in the temple and said, "Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." Luke chapter 1, verse 13. The silence broke, and the next voice to speak after 400 years of quiet was the voice of an angel announcing the forerunner of the Messiah. God's silence was never abandonment. It was a breath before the greatest sentence ever spoken. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. John chapter 3, verse 16. If this opens something for you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs it. If you have not seen it yet, our first 2 videos walk through every book of the Old Testament and every book of the New Testament. The links are in the description. Drop a comment and tell us what you want us to cover next. God bless you.